This book is as much history as anything else, and I'm reminded of, it's largely anecdotal, but it's a story of a young man who took his results to his parents. And the father looked at the result, and he did extremely well. His average scores, 80. But then he came to history, and the young man scored 25. And the father looked at him and said, how could you have done so well in mathematics, physics, chemistry, and then you ended up getting only 25 in history? He said, that is not my fault. Everything the teacher asked happened before I was born. And when I hear this talk about those agitating for Biafra, I didn't know war. It's actually, one way of looking at that is something that happened in New York in 1986, because I was holidaying there then. A young man burnt the American flag, and it angered the president, George Bush Sr. And there was a lot of debate across the United States as to the implications of what this young man had done. And there were a lot of letters in the New York Times. George Bush suggested the young man should be tried. And he said, we gave our blood for this. So why will this young man treat the flag with such disrespect? And the young man actually said, well, it's actually precisely because of your sacrifices for freedom. This is the freedom now that you fought for. So I'm only exercising the freedom you struggled for. But after a lot of professors, lawyers made all kinds of interventions, the most fascinating thing I remember was a letter in New York Times. And the letter simply said, look, you can try this young man, but you can try him not for violating the Constitution or by burning the Constitution. You can try him for environmental pollution. On a more serious note, I think, history, which is something I love very much, is highly a contested subject. And history is made up of contestations because it's always about he said, I said, they said, we said. And so, of course, I like the point about narratives. The question is who owns the narrative? And I think that when we look back at what has happened and what this book tries to address, it is really to raise the question of what happens after. How do the victims tell their story? And I think for me, one of the most fascinating things I have found, and I seem to be alone, and maybe I should say I seem to be alone in thinking that I find the Igbos extraordinarily intriguing. And I worry about the lamentations because I hear them. But I think there is a theoretical misconception as to the distinction between power and office. There's a lot of lamentation about an Igbo man not being president or how many are ministers, which ministries are yeye ministries, which ones are the good ministries. But really, for the 21st century, office holding is actually out of the window. And they were really thinking now and should be privileging ideas and knowledge. Something that I believe the Igbos have, in such huge quantities. But I will speak to that at the end of my presentation. But just to say that I also find the Jewish people very fascinating because even after losing everything, I was looking up the records. And perhaps outside Israel, I don't know where else anybody of Israeli descent is president or prime minister. And yet, you cannot move forward or backward in American politics without the influence of the Israeli lobby. So really, for me, the question is to square the cycle and ask, what is the relationship between office and power? That theoretically, you can have office without power. And it is possible to have power without office. And I think for me, these are some of the issues that an extraordinarily endowed people like the Igbos should really be contesting. However, perhaps that is a conversation for another day. But when I looked up the list, I also discovered that, in Nigeria, the Igbos have done what, I don't know whether it has happened in any country. That is, they lost the war and then took over the narrative. Because everything there is to be said about Biafra or about the Civil War has been written by the Igbos. And there is, of course, there are those who have written a bit of faction and fiction. People like Eddie Iro, Chimamanda is a cross between faction and fiction. But again, when you look at people like Ben Bully and others who actually dealt with very concrete historical realities to give interpretation to what really happened, I think a combination of these forces then suggests that perhaps, I think, as they say about history not being taught in Nigeria, I think we need to be looking at a slightly different template, because I looked at the facts and I found that the Jewish people, who constitute only a mere 14 million or 0.02% of the world population, have in the last 50 or so years, or more, well, perhaps more, 10 Nobel laureates in literature. 8 Jewish people have received the Nobel Peace Prize. A staggering 53 have received the Nobel Prize for Physics. 13 have received the Nobel Prize for Economics. And 44 have received the Nobel Prize for Medicine. So I think from the point of view of impact and influence, we must add the mix in this conversation when we're thinking about the future of Biafra and so on, a range of other issues that I think we need to place on the table. Now, I went through the book, and as I said, I don't want to repeat some of the things that have already been said. But I think that going forward, it's not so much what happened, but it is, for me, it's really not so much what has happened. But what is more important is what followed the day after. Now, we are not the only people to have fought a civil war. The United States was colonized. Japan lost the war. The Germans lost the war. And what I mean by what happened the day after is, how does a people decide to define their future? And for me, I think this is also a very critical question, because along with that then ties in the larger national issue, national question. Now, after the Civil War, we had the 3 R's, reconciliation, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. Well, my favorite book remains Cyprian Ekwensi's little book titled Survive the Peace. Well, you can ask the question, how do you survive the peace? But Cyprian Ekwensi demonstrated quite eloquently in that little book, the fact that after the war, survival became a problem. And I think the problem is perhaps we may have been overwhelmed with the whole idea of victory, that we forgot to develop a real template for thinking about how do you really reconstruct a society. And part of the problem with the Nigerian situation is that, well, of course, as you said, because of the broken roads, because of the lack of electricity, and because of the lack of infrastructure, when we think about reconstruction, we are thinking only in physical terms. This is the same conversation we're having about Boko Haram. Namely, when we think about the Northeast, we're thinking about infrastructure and so on. Nobody is saying anything or paying attention to how do we reconstruct the minds of a generation of young people who are going to be maybe 20, they're going to be 20, they're going to be 15, they're going to be 60, they're going to be 70. A post-Boko Haram group of young people, how will they relate to Nigeria? Now, I think if we look at what happened and what FDR did in the United States, because I think it speaks to the whole question of how do we talk about reconstruction and rehabilitation. Namely, the whole idea, which I believe many of you here know more than myself, but when FDR decided to think about what will happen when these young Americans who have tested war and held a gun and seen death and seen survival and seen blood and seen injury, when they come back, what am I going to do with them? Because those, for me, are the fundamental questions. It's not enough to disarm Boko Haram people. And like Cyprian Ekwensi illustrated in the book, I think, if I remember well, he talks about the fact that, when the war ended, people changed there were these young people coming with their shirts in leather bags. They changed their uniform, threw away their guns, and it was the guns that other people took and then went to the street. And that was how armed robbery started. So really, the real question is, when you have a society in which so many young people have been exposed to violence, how do you turn things around? The reason is, I foresee that perhaps in another 20, 30, 40 years, we'll still be discussing these issues, perhaps at a slightly different level. But the GI Bill tried to deal with quite a few factors. Because FDR says, when these young people come, what am I going to do with them? Now, it offered people who had fought in the war low housing, it offered them loans, offered them an opportunity to go to school, and so on and so forth. And the result then was that within a 10, 15-year period, many people who fought in the war, a lot of people had managed, over 2 million people had managed to get education. Over 5.6 million people had managed to start a business and do all kinds of other things. And I think the knock-on impact and implication of that for the development of America is what we now see. So for me, I think that the issues raised in this book, and I hear Professor Soludo about Kanu and about Biafra. My views are slightly different, and they are, of course, based on the fact that I'm not very informed about the issues. But I like the point he made, namely that if you have these people who are telling you, okay, let them go on, but I have so much luggage, I'm not about to pick this luggage and go back home. Really, the truth of the matter is that nobody is happy in Nigeria. This is one country that I find rather interesting. You have an extraordinarily gifted population, extremely wealthy people. You can, British Airways, first class is already full. Lufthansa, first class is already full. You enter, you see the Nigerians, and you see them well-dressed, and you say, oh, guy, you're looking well. The Nigerian will say, it's photo trick. Now, how do we address the whole question of a nation that is so eternally gifted but unable to recognize even the gift that it possesses? And I think this is where the book ends with a very interesting story, and I'd like to end on that point, namely, the story of that the author takes in Things Fall Apart, story of Unoka, who, as a farmer, wasn't doing so well. And like most Nigerians, if you are not doing well, it's because somebody else has done something. And he decided to go and made offerings to the gods. And I like this. It's a beautiful little story. But at the end, the man is told, look, my dear, there is nothing wrong with you. He said, your problem is, quote, your neighbors, that is those who grow a lot of yams that you can see. There's nothing wrong with you. No witchcraft, nothing. It is that those, your neighbors, who go to virgin forest, that's where they go to. They go to the virgin forest, cut down the trees. That's where they plant their yams. Others cross 7 rivers to make their farms. But you, Unoka, you stay at home and offer sacrifices to a reluctant soil. So go home and walk like a man. Now, I like the story because if you flip that story around, the problem really is that people have gone to they've crossed the seas. Okay? They've crossed the seas. And they can't understand why I will have the best education you can get anywhere in the world, and I'm still unemployed. And I think for me that is a critical question. And it's a question that a conversation of this nature must address. Whether the Igbos want to address it as a nation, but the truth of the matter is that I don't know anywhere in the world where a political class has decided about how things are going to be. Most of the changes we are witnessing in Europe, in America, about how states have come to be where they are the result of the vision, a crazy dream of a madman who thought about how things should be. In the way Bernard Shaw said, some see things and they ask why. He said some others see things and they ask why not. There is nothing inevitable about how Nigeria ought to be. Absolutely nothing. The question is that when we outsource our responsibilities by blaming government, by blaming the Fulanis, by blaming the Igbos, by blaming the Yorubas, by blaming men, and so on, there's enough blame to go around. But I think the problem, again, as I said, is that Unoka may have just come to terms with the fact that even though people have, of course, he probably has not gone to, the rivers that are distant. But I come back to the point made by the Emir of Kano. Because those who have crossed 7 rivers and come back can't justify why they have such a poor harvest. Because the Emir of Kano said you can sit down, and there are people sitting down, picking up a telephone call, and making $1 billion naira, and it's only in Nigeria. that you can sit down and one telephone call and an hour later, you are a billionaire. It's only in Nigeria that you can sit down and a few hours later, with a signature, you've become a billionaire. So I think these are some of the issues. And I just want to conclude by saying, well, the question then is, how do we move from here to the destination that we are aiming at? I read some of the things, and I heard, what he said about Sardauna being a federalist. But of course, since I come from Kaduna State, my views might be slightly modified, but I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there. But I think what the book deals with also is the whole question of state creation. And I think the tragedy with the Nigerian situation is that we try to solve this problem in a way, a manner that is slightly different from the way other African nations have dealt with these problems, which is that I don't have the facts. But I think the average country that was colonized by the British in Africa and most parts of Asia, I think it's only Nigeria that decided to create states. The Ghanaians don't have states. People of South Africa don't have states. Other African countries don't have states. And I think we must locate the source of our problem from this point, namely, and we can go on, and I think Professor Soludo made the point. You can create new states, but every time you create a new state, a majority becomes a minority becomes a majority, and the contestation is renewed. And the issues are basically the same, namely a tiny circle of elite that simply want to serve nobody but themselves. And I think for me, these are where the issues are. So I consider this quite a worthy contribution, and like you rightly say, the debate must start. And I think our generation is probably the most well-equipped to start this conversation. The place to start is here, and I think the time to start is now. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to share in this wonderful occasion. Thank you.